And also, I just have one more thing to pass around, and I hope that this isn't a distraction. But the Dayton Council on World Affairs and a number of other organizations are sponsoring a town hall forum, a local viewing of a national webcast, okay, with the president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. It's going to be held on campus at Wright State University, and it is October 18th, beginning at 8 o'clock in the evening. If any of you, and I know a couple of you have participated in these in the past, it's quite interesting because they'll have the speakers, they will be discussing and will be part of the webcast, but we can send in questions, the audience. And Donna, I think each year a question from Dayton, Ohio has been honored. And we're really quite privileged as a city to be able to host. This will be at least our third time that we're hosting one of these webcasts. So I'll pass that around, and it's in the evening, so parking will be very simple. It'll be in our student union at Wright State. And also Stephen Orlins, who is the president of the National Committee of U.S.-China Relations, will be speaking on Wright State's campus in the afternoon on November 3rd. So I'll pass this around with those details. David Lampton, who wrote your piece for today, is a former president. Should I start it here and then? Former president of this national committee. And this committee was formed to make sure that we can promote as much understanding as possible between our two countries and recognizing the absolute critical nature of this relationship. So if you have any time on either October 18th or November 3rd and you're interested in these China issues, please join us for that discussion. Okay, and if I remember correctly, there's a bus that everybody needs to catch at, does the bus leave at Quarter Till, or do you need to leave here at Quarter Till? Leave here, okay. Okay, so I will try to keep an eye on time, but also you can signal me if I'm continue to talk too much. One of the aspects that I want to highlight, and please, as I said earlier, please interrupt me with questions. If we're going down a path, if you'd rather talk about something else, I will be happy to shift. But I think this picture of what I call mass engagement in China in its many different forms, I think this is important to highlight because even though it's really clear to all of us, China is not a democracy as we would understand a democracy. My friends say that it's a people's democracy, but a liberal democracy they do not have. There is so much more interaction and give and take between citizens and leaders in China today. And perhaps as background, before I talk about those different areas, Pew Charitable Trust and Pew Research Project every year does these fantastic annual surveys of global opinions. Do you know China receives the highest approval rating of any of the countries surveyed? And in 2008, it was 86% approval. Now, Pew goes to great lengths to make sure that this is a valid sample and that there's not significant outside influencing factors on those decisions. But that tells us something. When China applied for the Olympic Games, part of the application to the International Olympic Committee, they had to say, in what agreement is your population for hosting this? And China reported, I think, they had 92% support for the Games. When the International Olympic Committee did their own independent survey, they found 94%. So, there's something to be said there. Now, let's not quibble about the actual statistic. I raise this to highlight, despite what we may assume as Westerners who believe in human rights and democracy and the need for that around the world, there's something that citizens are finding within their current system that they are agreeing with. Now, that being said, I study protests in China and I study demonstrations, and there's a lot of that as well. But I think that that's really important to highlight, that there is quite a bit of approval and satisfaction. Okay, just some of the areas I was planning to highlight here. We talked briefly about the internet and China having the world's largest internet population. And that's recent. Okay, really even just 2 years ago, China was ranked 3rd or 4th. The way most people access the internet in China? It's the way I still can, through their phones. We think of the internet and we think of connection to a computer, and it's through people's mobile phones, which of course is a much more immediate connection to the internet than what we have, and we have to make sure we've got an internet connection and a password for the firewall. So I think as Americans, we tend to approach the internet in a fairly simplistic way sometimes, where we think, when I was in grad school again, it was really the age of the internet. My first day of graduate school, I sent my first email message. Now, my parents still have never sent an email message, but I sent my first email message, and here I was as a very struggling graduate student. I kept saying, they're going to find me, and they're going to charge me for that, and it's going to be outrageous. So think about how recent our experience with the internet is. Well, early on, everybody, I believe, had this expectation that the internet could bring more engagement, more democracy, accountability with leaders, because we're all going to go home tonight and email President Obama and tell him what we don't like about this current policy. We now understand it's much more multifaceted. And look at what's been going on this past summer and early fall in Colombia. Some of that's been happening in China as well. When we talk about civil society, if people have freedom to gather, they're going to gather for good things and sell Girl Scout cookies and build houses. But we have uncivil society as well. Well, people get together and figure out how we can exclude others. And in Colombia, if you haven't heard, there have been these groups that essentially in a couple of cities have said, here's a list of 10 teenagers. If they stay in this city over the next 2 weeks, they're going to be murdered. And there were some murders that came out of that list. China has its own version of this. It's called human flesh searching. Is a direct translation. It's a terrible translation, but it's a direct translation. And we look at the internet as a way to spread information and awareness. This can be done in a very intrusive way as well. And what we've seen in a number of cities in China in the last 2 years is that an individual will be targeted. Sometimes, because of a nasty divorce, because of problems at work. One woman was targeted because she abused her cat. And then information about that person is put on a social network, similar to a Facebook sort of community. And the person's home address was listed, their work address, their telephone number, and people have just been completely followed. Some people have been attacked. So, we talk about social networking with the internet. There's very anti-social networking that is taking place as well. And again, on this bit, don't assume that the internet means engagement with politics. When I was there and going to internet cafes and typing email messages, crowds would gather around me. And they said, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm sending email. What are you doing? They were playing internet games. So, the internet is not always this connection to the New York Times and the New Yorker and the Wall Street Journal. There's many different avenues as well. This is a picture that appeared in the New York Times talking about much of the cyber warfare that's taking place between China and the United States. And my colleagues at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base are saying this is the threat from China that they're most concerned about. And look at some of the breaches of security that we've seen, well, even most recently in other regions of the world. And trying to combat this, especially in the case of this individual who is profiled, always with this back to the camera, but this individual who is profiled, he's just an individual blogger, tech savvy, knows what he's doing. He lives with his parents, earns some extra income in little contracts with the government to try to break into security systems around the world. How do you try to rein that in? This is not Chinese government manipulating huge groups of people to do this. This is small contracts going out to technologically savvy 20-somethings who work one full-time job but earn a lot more money at night trying to break into these systems. So those are some other aspects of the internet that I think warrant some of our attention. NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Now, as I put on the screen, and this is silly, but it's true, in China, they're actually governmentally organized non-governmental organizations. And that's what they call them. And as silly as that sounds, it takes us back to that image of China as a government that controls association. Even though these groups have to register and their roster is scrutinized for membership, these groups exist and they form. And it's not quite this huge controlling hand that we might imagine. Do you want to guess what the largest association or the largest topic of organization for gongos in China is? It's an issue. It's an area of research and development that China is exceeding in right now. Think wind turbines, environmental issues, environmental sustainability. And you know, this is one area where if we had had this conversation 5 years ago, it was doom and gloom. China's destroying their environment. You know, I would give you the example of the Three Gorges Dam. Now, have you heard about the South to North Water Diversion Project? South to north. I mean, pick out that map again. It's essentially defying gravity. They are rerouting some of the major lakes in China to try to return some water to the north where the population lives. So I would give you, you know, all these examples of how China is destroying their environment. And they still are destroying their environment. But they are leading the way. They are light years ahead of where we are in the United States right now, especially in wind technology and wind turbines. In fact, many wind turbines that are being made in China are then being installed in Texas to try to test their development. And this is one area that the Chinese government has put a lot of money in to try to carve a niche. And they are right now. They're doing very well. They're just behind the Northern Europeans in much of this development. The two major areas of association for the gongos are environment and healthcare. I think that's very telling. You know, we talk about the challenges of our healthcare system. My husband's a paramedic, so we talk about this at dinner. But we talk about the challenges of our healthcare system. In China, that all used to be part of the social safety net provided by your Communist Party. Well, you know what? That net is torn to shreds right now for healthcare, especially in the rural areas. So these are two areas of association that have flourished in this gongo network. Now, in order to approve the roster for membership for the gongos, a person cannot be included if they have ever been labeled a political dissident. So, you know, there is certainly this area that's not gray at all on who's allowed to join them and who is not. But I think sometimes when we only see controlling communist government, we miss a lot of this other activity with the gongos. Then religious associations. This is something I've done a little bit of research in more recently. You know, when you think China and you think communist, you think atheist, right? Religion is the opiate of the masses. And certainly, some of you may have had some connections to, you know, some of the brutal torture and other challenges faced by many foreign missionaries in China right after the Communist Revolution. China actually has now quite a vibrant religious and spiritual life among many of its people. Estimates, this is really hard to measure. I've seen anywhere from 10 to 12 million. And that's catch-all for all Christians in China. It doesn't even count Buddhists and Muslims. There's a very small Jewish community in a couple of areas as well, which we could talk about further. Very interesting history with that group. And then I've seen other people say that that estimate could be as high as 50 to 70 million. So, you know, give or take which one you're going to land in. It's increasing is the important thing. And for each of these associations, you have above ground gatherings, and then you have so-called underground gatherings, more accurately referred to as unregistered communities. I did some field research at a Catholic church in Tianjin. It's China's third largest city. If you followed the Olympic Games and you're a soccer fan, it's where they had the soccer games in 2008. And I remember the first couple of weeks that I would be there, there was always this group outside chanting, singing some songs, and I wondered, who are they? I found out that's the underground church that was, of course, gathering right outside of this huge cathedral as loud as could be. Not my image of underground. They were unregistered. Okay, they were there as a protest. They would be on their knees for the hour and 45 minutes that everybody else would be having the church service. China, this was in the mid-1990s, was still following a pre-Vatican II style of worship. I have to say, I had never experienced that before. A Latin Mass. I go to China to go to a Latin Mass with 14 servers, all in total crimson covering. Very different experience, because in the mid-1990s, relations between the Vatican and Beijing were completely strained. So one of the ways that China would express that was not following the sentiment of Vatican II and keeping the Latin Mass. The irony there is very, very rich. But you have, for the Protestant churches, I've interviewed many Protestant seminary leaders and some of the pastors. Same thing you have. Above ground churches that are supported, permitted, and facilitated by the Communist Party. My pastor at my field church was also the president of the All China Communist Youth League in Tianjin. Now again, you know, a priest who's the Communist Youth League minister seems kind of a disconnect. You have the above ground, and then you have this unregistered or unofficial. And one of the reasons why our statistics are so stretched in this regard is because people can cross both communities. Okay, people can be part of the unregistered when they're not happy with the way things are, and then, you know, for other ceremonies be part of the register. But we see this in all of the religious traditions in China. And as you may be aware, just from following even casually in the New York Times or the Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, much religious expression today in China. Some of it legal, some of it illegal, but all of it happening. And then we get into the question of what is a religion versus what is a cult. You all have heard about that Falun Gong group, which practices Tai Chi. Any association is cause for some concern of the Chinese authorities if it's not registered as a Gonggo. Okay, so religious association, quite a bit going on right now. Yes?
Well, if you're a member of the church, then you're not a communist.
No, that's not seen to be, here we would say that you would probably need to give up your card-carrying communist credentials to be a member of the church. No, you can be both. You can be both. Now, in the, with the Falun Gong, with this one spiritual group, and some of the other more groups that kind of test the boundaries, the party said you cannot be a leader of any level of the Communist Party and be a member of these churches that are not recognized. That was sort of where they drew the line. Okay, excellent question. Then complaint bureaus. In full disclosure, this is my dissertation topic, so I don't want to say, I'm afraid I could talk about this for a couple weeks. Offices exist at every level of the bureaucracy. Government, you know, city, township, province, national, hospitals, schools, any association that is run by the government has a formal office to receive what they call letters and visits, okay, where you can write a letter and sign it, or you can just show up and say, this is what I'm really upset about. And that will then launch an investigation. When I studied these in the mid-1990s, the numbers of people who were going to complain was higher and higher each year. Now there's so many of these offices all across the country. Do people always get their resolution that they're hoping for? I mean, how many of us write letters to our officials and it just gets piled? You know, I mean, this is part of engagement with you don't expect that all of a sudden the policy is going to change because you write a letter. But the fact that so many citizens are incurring some risk and participating in this shows us, I believe, some of this engagement of society. So just quite a bit going on. I was asked during the break to talk a little bit about newspapers. China is a very literate society, and people actually still read the print newspapers. You know, at the beginning of this quarter, I asked my students, how many of you read any newspaper? And Dayton Daily, USA Today. Do you know none of my students physically touch a newspaper? It's all over the internet, which, as you know, because many of you probably go back and forth, it's a very different reading experience on the internet versus, you know, paging through it and getting the ink, although you really don't get the ink on your hands anymore. China remains a very literate society of newspapers, similar to the way things used to be not so long ago in this country. You have morning dailies, and then you have afternoon or evening dailies, and it's very common, in my experience, to be walking down a street or riding a bike and seeing people simply sitting outside going through multiple newspapers. Now, how free are the newspapers in China? They're each connected to a party or a government office. Okay, so you don't have, there is an underground press that exists, but that's mostly internet and is limited and operates with great risk. The newspapers are connected to party or government offices. That being said, you might be surprised at the amount of dissension and even debate that takes place over some policies and discussions within those newspapers. And there's lots of sectors of newspapers. The People's Liberation Army Navy, okay, the Navy has their newspaper. The Environmental Bureau has their newspaper. Youth, you've got national youth paper, provincial youth papers, city youth papers, lots and lots of newspapers. So a very literate society in that regard. Please.
Doesn't that kind of go counter to the fact that they have an internet and they have it via the phone?
The question was, does that contradict the internet and the way people are connecting to the internet? You know, I think maybe what I experience with my students now, where nobody reads a paper, maybe might come to China in maybe 10 years. I think you see both. You see both right now, because still the readership has been declining slightly, but you still have so many newspapers that they're not experiencing that big change that we have here, where we wonder, is the New York Times going to continue to be printed? So maybe we'll see that in 5 or 10 years in China, but not yet, not yet. And to add to that, there's a lot of weekly magazines that are published by these same conglomerates that are still very popular, even though perhaps people could connect to some of that material online. So that's a great observation. Any questions or comments?
Well, how about their TV and their news coverage?
TV and news coverage was the question. This used to be my cure to insomnia in China, to turn on to the evening news, because it was everything you would expect it to be, very bland presentation. That's starting to change a little bit. You still have it's still connected to the Central Propaganda Bureau. There are many satellite stations now. Now this is funny. As soon as they made satellites in China illegal, you could guess what happened. Everybody put them up. And those satellites will carry many news programs from Hong Kong, which Hong Kong, as some of you have lived in Hong Kong is an extremely vibrant press. There's some self-censorship in, but some of that has been carried over into the media in China. If you're interested in this, there's a great video, and we own it at Wright State, so many of you might be able to borrow it through the consortium. It's called Win in China. Fabulous. It was put together by Orville Schell and his son, and have any of you seen it or heard of it? Because Fallows wrote about it in Atlantic Monthly a little bit. It chronicles the Chinese version of The Apprentice. Now, I don't know how many of you have watched The Apprentice, but cutthroat competition to get a lot of money to start your business. This TV series in China, it continues today, has been very, very popular, and it crosses this news versus reality show because of that official sponsorship that I was just highlighting. And the Central Propaganda Bureau promoted this show, Win in China, as a way to encourage discussion throughout the country of a need for new values, new entrepreneurial values. It's astonishing. I show it in almost every one of my classes because the students sit there and it just blows any image that they have of China out of the water. I'm not a regular watcher or viewer of The Apprentice or any of those shows, but from what I've seen, this is much more cutthroat and much more pure competition, entrepreneurial spirit than anything that we've had. So this is evidence of the government harnessing a very popular form of entertainment, reality TV, adapting it for Chinese circumstances with this encouraging entrepreneurial activity and capitalism, but maintaining, this is a Central Propaganda Bureau promoted show. One of the main promoters for the show was Yao Ming, the basketball player, and many other entrepreneurs in the country, including some of those billionaires I highlighted earlier. So it's not nearly as bland as it was even 10 years ago, but there's still that element of supervision. Okay, excellent. Yes?
In their schools, do they give a real positive interpretation of the United States in their history classes and,
I'm most familiar with the educational programs at the university level, so that's really what I could comment on. I've read anecdotally that it's a mixed picture at middle school level, that the United States was the aggressor in Korea and that this was, the triumph of the Communist Party to hold them to a stalemate. But as far as the current issues, it is more positive than most people would expect. Now, the change that I have noticed, both in curriculum but more in attitudes of college students and graduate students who study political science, when I was there in the mid-1990s, it was all emulation. How could we be more like you? Give us as much information as you can. I lectured about the Electoral College everywhere I went. They wanted to know, and how could we adapt this to China? When I went back a couple years later in 2002, that had shifted. Let me tell you how we do it differently than the United States and why this is a good model. And I think some of this is, a growing assertiveness that we saw at Copenhagen, at environmental discussions, and a sense now that there is a Chinese way of being modern. There's a Chinese way of having politics and economics that works for us, that's going to be different than the United States. And this is where they're getting a loud voice in many of the third world countries, especially in Africa, and saying, you don't have to do it the way the United States tells you to. You don't have to do it the way they've done it. Look at how we carved out our own model, and wouldn't you like to try? China's a major sponsor of Sudan. That should concern you. Yes?
Is there a large nomenclatura government bureaucracy that's disliked and that has special privileges?
The nomenclatura, if you're not familiar, it's a literal list of names of people who were eligible to take positions throughout the Chinese government. When I was a grad student at Ohio State, I joked, China is the second largest bureaucracy in the world, second only to Ohio State University. Because you've got this huge bureaucracy, and it used to be one of the ways that the party could control what took place in the country was by naming people to head hospitals, head middle schools. All of that was nearly central or provincial level appointments. Bureaucrats today remain. The amount of privilege that they have, I would say, has decreased quite a bit, especially political bureaucrats, because we now have this whole financial entrepreneurial class and the technocrats. One of your participants came up with this great list of characteristics of China today, and one of the first ones was it's a technocracy ruled by people who have technical and oftentimes scientific and engineering skills. These people are part of the bureaucracy with appointments and offices, yet they don't have the sort of privileges I think you may have in mind because of their office and in the hierarchy, but because of their access and their role in policy, because of their training. And when I had the picture of the 4 leaders up there with Mao Zedong, it was all about privilege and hierarchy. It didn't matter what you knew, what your skill was. We've now moved to the extreme of that. And so I don't think you see quite that amount of privilege. In fact, lifetime bureaucrats are often criticized for being lifetime bureaucrats who don't have a skilled area. And that's why you see that now even in the leadership. Please.
Some said that the Soviet Union collapsed because of its own dead weight.
Right.
Bureaucrats, is China going in that direction too? That it's just, they're like, Louis XIV's bureaucracy?
I'm very careful about comparisons between the Soviet Union and China because their experiences with communism were so completely different. When the center in the Soviet Union gave way, everything fell out from underneath. In China, the vibrancy has always been in the localities and well beyond Beijing. That as the center has gradually withdrawn from politics, we see nothing but innovation and we see much more activism. So in that regard, I'm not saying China won't collapse tomorrow because it's really hard to see whether or not what happened. But I think much of that bureaucratic dead weight is lifting, especially with these economic changes and with this economic and these technocratic changes. So I don't think that they suffer with that heavy weight as much as we saw with the Soviet Union. Okay. Great. Yes, please.
Yes, could you please speak to the issue about the one child per family? I think that policy began about 20 years ago, and is there still discrimination about female babies that are born?
Excellent question, thank you. Yes, the policy became a national policy late 1970s. They were applying it in some areas prior to that, but it became a priority then. So we're seeing now this generation that's coming of age and marrying, they are products of that one child per couple policy. What a dramatic example of human and social engineering. Because we didn't talk at all about Confucian China, but one of the most important elements of Confucian China was the centrality of the family, and especially the extended family, aunts, uncles, cousins. Well, now you have a whole generation of kids who don't have cousins, okay? And that just as a shift in how society operates has been huge. It continues today as a priority, but there's many more exceptions to the policy now than we've ever seen, because China has held its population growth in the urban areas to 0 and negative, and in the urban areas on the coast is where you have the educated segment of the population. The areas where we've seen continued population growth has been in the countryside, where you still struggle with literacy, and where the group has been challenging many policies. One of the reasons for that, when they first designed it's called planned birth policy, euphemistically. When they first came up with the planning, they said the only way that's going to have any buy-in across the country is if we give some privileges to ethnic minorities, and if we make some allowances for when girl children are born first in the countryside. Okay, the first one was a clear appeal of unity to the ethnic minorities in China. We will honor your ethnicity by giving you the privilege of having more than one child. The second one, I remember the day I learned about this. I was at an All-China Women's Federation meeting, and the woman who was speaking to us said, look at how this policy accommodates the needs of women. If a girl child is born first, the family can try again to have a boy. I raised my hand and said, how is that, holding up girls and gender privilege at all? She said quite clearly, it's being done to prevent female infanticide. Now, please note, female infanticide in China predated the communist period by centuries, and is not only a byproduct of the one child per couple policy. But those two exceptions, the ethnic minorities in China are concentrated in the West, okay, and in the countryside. So those two exceptions have produced a much higher birth rate in the Western regions than in the cities. So here's the most recent exception. If two people marry, and you need to apply for permission to get married in China, by the way. My husband and I went to the Justice of the Peace to make it all legal, but we did not have to go to our work units for permission. In China, people who are still in state-supplied jobs, which is decreasing, but in state-supplied jobs, it's a matter of permission. And then, where was I going with that? The two people who go and they apply for marriage, if they are both products of a one-child family, they can have 2 children. This is trying to encourage the growth, or the birth rate, trying to increase the birth rate of the educated urban class. You know what? It's not making a difference in the world. And they're still struggling with this. So the social engineering that is the one child per couple policy, as it enters the second generation, even more social engineering in some ways, because they're realizing, wow, when you mess with Mother Nature, you're going to have some challenges. You may be familiar with the skewed gender ratio, the skewed sex ratio in China. When I was doing my dissertation work, one night I had this great meeting, all graduate students in political science, no clear minders from the government in the room with us, although I'm sure people were taking notes. As we talked, and they invited me to ask questions, I said, what's the biggest issue that you struggle with in the People's Republic of China today? And I'm thinking, democracy, human, I'm approaching this as American. Do you know what 3 out of the first 4 people said? Dates. We can't find dates. And these were all men. And I tried to blow it off and say, dating is tough in any society. And they said, no, look around the university. How many women's dorms are there? How many men's dorms are there? And that was the clearest recognition that there are so many unmarriageable men in China, and the women have they've got the best pickings, I guess. But they were saying this, and they were saying it in complete sincerity, in complete seriousness, because in Chinese society, you're not viewed to be an adult until you're married. And many sociologists, this is not my field of research, but many sociologists say this skewed sex ratio that has always existed in China, but has been exacerbated by one-child policies, is really going to become a dilemma, socially, economically. Many people say militarily, this could have an impact as well. And there have been a couple very interesting books. One of the books is called The Bare Branches. And the idea is that you have a family tree, and when that family tree ends, the tree, when you don't marry, that tree ends as well. And discussing those ramifications. Some Dutch sociologists completed that. So one child continues. It is a matter, when I talked about the complaint bureaus, it's one of the biggest areas of complaint. But not just the existence of the policy, because people they're very sensitive to what you can complain about. You can't attack central level policy. You won't win. But if you say our local cadre is over rigidly enforcing the one-child policy, yet he has 4 known children that are roaming the countryside, that is an area ripe for complaint and for some action and sanction. Yes?
Just, I hate to say it, but it sounds, if you exceed your quota or your allocation, what are the penalties?
Yeah.
It's an agent out there.
That's going to vary by region. It's a central directive with local policies for how you implement it. There usually are financial sanctions, and those can be severe. If you have a child outside, you pay for their schooling, you pay for their health care, and that is an exorbitant cost, especially to people in the countryside. I actually found a copy of this once. If you follow the policy, you get a certificate as a one-child family. So there's positive incentives, which are pretty meaningless, but negatively, it's usually some form of financial sanction. It's very difficult to verify, but we know that forced abortions continue, including very late in pregnancy. When we talk about the technocracy of China and science and technology, this is going to have spillover effects into reproductive policies as well. And so much of the skewed sex ratio that we see is very sex-selective abortions, including very late in pregnancy. Is that always coercive? It's hard for us to tell. I also think, having been at a university where the kindergarten was right across the street from my dormitory, I also think there's a lot of social pressure that how can a child in kindergarten talk about going to his big brother's soccer game if nobody else even knows what a big brother, has a big brother? So I think that there's some of that social side of it as well that also can be quite effective in encouraging types of behavior, but primarily financial. I always get asked, what if a person is pregnant with twins? They are able to carry those to term. The triplets and the quadruplets that are so common in our society are much less common in China because they're not going to have, people aren't going to be taking those sorts of fertility treatments for various reasons. When you apply for permission to get married in China, you then discuss with your permission grantor, the decider, what form of birth control you're going to practice. Now, I share that with my students, and I say, can you even imagine, that question coming from a public official here because of our notions of privacy. Also, a marriage certificate is a very important document in China that you will carry around with you and that you will be asked to present if you're going to stay at a hotel, particularly outside of the main cities. Shanghai, Beijing, that's going to be, they operate on different rules. But outside of the major cities, the only thing I used my marriage certificate for was to get football tickets at Ohio State for my husband. So, that's a very important form of identity that the people are going to carry. It shows some of the control. It shows how important football tickets are too, I guess. So, other questions on maybe the social area?
Are these,
sorry.
when they're young, are they kind of groomed for certain jobs? We'll talk about freedom here. They don't have the freedom evidently when they're younger. They're kind of geared towards a certain profession or certain jobs, so they don't have the freedoms that maybe when they graduate they can do this or this or this, right? Is that
Yeah, there's a lot, almost similar to some of the European systems where there's tracking of students very early on into who's cut out for university education and who's not. There's a lot of that. Strong encouragement of what we call the STEM fields here: science, technology, engineering, and medicine. Medicine, even to be a practicing doctor, is an undergraduate degree in China. Then you can go on for specialization. So there is much encouragement of that. The amount of control and that I cannot comment very knowingly on, except that with national policies and poster campaigns, these are the careers that are strongly encouraged. University education in China is a sought-after resource that's very, very limited. They have a national exam that everybody takes in the spring. I was there one year, the day of the national exam. The sense of tension was palpable across the country. And even if you score very, very highly on that exam, your ability to get into one of the top-rated universities is still very slim, just because of the supply and demand issue. So all that's going to impact career choice as well.
Despite the fact that she spoke as quickly as possible.
Sorry.